So today's Digital Humanities Colloquium presentation is by Janelize Morelli, Listening at the Boundaries, Data Sonification, Music, and Sound Art as Practices in Digital Humanities. Now, Janelize Morelli is an Associate Professor of Music at the Northwest University and a member of the Masara Research Entity. She teaches undergraduate modules in community music and music education. Janelize holds a PhD in music education from NYU Steinert School of Culture, Education and Human Development. She supervises postgraduate students interested in transformative music education and community music. And her research interests include the ethics of post-human music education, music technology and accessibility, and community music. She is currently exploring themes related to the ways in which human-computer interactions contribute to or detract from participatory musicking ethics. Janelize is an avid supporter of arts-based research, exploring data sonification and participatory musicking as acts of public scholarships. And I think her presentation is on that as well. Let me stop my sharing and then Janelize, you can take over.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Menu. I'm just quickly going to set up the sharing on my side. And then always with the music stuff, it's important to check that the sound okay and shared. Okay. So thank you. I see
your screen. Yeah.
I see many familiar names and faces, and I also see many people who have a lot of experience in electronic and computer music. Which is very exciting for me. So today, I asked one of my colleagues, if you were to attend something like this, what would you expect? And he said, I'd like the Wikipedia version of whatever's going on. And so it's not in great depth, but I hope that we can cover enough ground that we can have an interesting discussion at the end. And I'm also, as I told many at the beginning, I'm really interested in knowing who here is open to collaborating on this larger project. So you wake up in the morning. It's just a normal weekday morning. And before you've even opened your eyes, you are immersed in moments of sonic meaning making. You hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock in your kitchen, and this entrains you to the passing of time. And as the coffee machine goes beep, beep, it signals that your cup of coffee is finally ready. On your bedside table, you hear your phone ringing, the ringtone that you've assigned to your mother, and depending on the kind of day, it affects your mood one way or the other. After 15 minutes of church talk and did you hear about so-and-so's son doing this and that, you hear a ping from your phone indicating that your battery's at 20% and it's reminding you to put your phone on charge. So stepping outside, you are immersed in the cadence of traffic and uncurated sounds as the city is waking up. As you quickly reverse out of your parking spot, you hear the beep alert you to the tree to your left. Thank goodness, because you forgot. We do not think about these moments, and yet they feel so intuitive, but they're us making meaning of the world through sound constantly. It's seamlessly woven into our daily lives. So if we don't notice these everyday sounds, what blind spots do exist in our practice as researchers in the humanities then for deliberately designing experiences of meaning making through sound? I'm going to share a little bit today, and I want to invite you to think about your own practice as someone working in the broader space of the digital humanities and how sound and sound studies might feature in your own work. The optophone reads printed text by converting light patterns into sound patterns in real time. A bright lamp projects a narrow beam through a fine slit onto the page, and it's a system for the lens to then read the type on the page. Behind the page, photosensors register whether each sub-beam is absorbed by black ink when there's no reflection or reflected by white paper. This sends an on-off signal, and then this is interpreted as sound. So here I've got an example of what this would sound like. Oops. Let's try that again. So the idea was that this would be an aid for people who are facing loss of sight to understand their world. I think many of us think of the Geiger counter as an early example of sonification, but I also find the optophone very interesting because it is so musical in its sonification, as it lies at the boundary. In this next example, you see sonification produced by Chandra X-ray Center, and they had support from NASA in creating this. So Dr. Kimberly Arkin, who's the astrophysicist on the project, and Dr. Matt Russo, as well as a musician, Andrew Santaguida, created this play on the Webb telescope's transmission spectrum of excess planet WASP 96. And so you'll hear that the wave tracks, and the longer the wavelength, the lower the note, and so it kind of tracks the wavelengths. As the vertical cursor sweeps across the graph, it triggers the corresponding musical tone, and it peaks associated with water absorption. And this is overlaid by the sound of falling droplets. And so although this isn't a recording of space itself, this crafted audio gives the listener an example of a way into listening into space. So this is another example of kind of more pure data sonification. Try that again. Maybe it's third time lucky. Maybe not. The next example is from Hearing Hubble. So I'm going to see if I can play this video. If you scan the QR code at the bottom of the slide, you'll be able to visit the app. So Hearing Hubble is a very interesting sonification, and it was launched in 2019. So here we can already see has kind of evolved. And I think to me, as someone thinking about if and to what extent we can make meaning of data through sound, it's very interesting to think about that boundary between sound and music. The next kind of concept that I've been mulling over is this idea of algorithmic music. And so in the broadest sense, algorithmic music then is a way to produce music through formal procedures. And this can be simple rules, it can be mathematical functions, and it can be computer programs. At the core of this idea is the idea that music can be codified, which already in itself is quite contentious. And that these codifications can be used to create systems, which will then serve as algorithms that can produce, transform, and organize sound without direct human input or alongside human input. Early examples would include the kind of experimental dice games that were very popular in the 18th century. So here we're thinking about Kirnberger and Mozart. And then there are other examples from Bell Labs in the 20th century, as well as, of course, Xenakis, who's probably one of the biggest influences with his formalized music. And today we're thinking about platforms like Magenta that use machine learning. So by framing composition as computation, algorithmic music invites us to question who and what gets to create music. And to me, as someone working in community music, this really became very interesting. So in community music, we place a lot of emphasis on relationship building between humans. At some point during my research in community music, I started becoming very interested in relationship building with humans and more than human participants. So Tonya writes about this, and she writes about the trauma that she experienced as part of music education in being separated from creating with the more than human. And currently, with our current cultural moment, I think it's a very interesting time to start thinking about both the more than human in the kind of biological world in which we exist, so ecologically more than human, but also to think about more than human collaborations with computers. And so I've been working over the last couple of years, specifically with my honors students, to design games that are based on rule-based systems that can produce participatory music events. So I just want to show you an application. And once again, there is a QR code for you. So in 1757, Kirnberger published Der Allezeit-fertige Menuetten- und Polonaisenkomponist, which was kind of a ready-made minuet and polonaise composer that let players roll the dice to select from a library of pre-composed fragments. This was one of the first documented stochastic composition games. And so here chance determines which melodic fragments and harmonic fragments are entered into the final composition. Mozart also published similar games. And of course, there are examples in the 20th century and 21st century of these as well. These examples yield trillions of possibilities, demonstrating how principled randomness could then generate coherent yet stylistically defined compositions. And so then just as kind of an overview into the development of algorithmic music, another very important contribution is then, of course, the Iliac suite with Heller and Isaacson creating this on Iliac 1. And it was really the world's first fully computer-composed piece, completed in 1956 at the University of Illinois. It has 4 movements, and they grow progressively more complex in their algorithmic complexity. The first one is kind of Renaissance melodies. The second adds to the texture with some white noise. And then this really shows that it was showed at the time that it was possible to create well-programmed machines that could compose coherent music without the traditional compositional scaffolding involved. Now I wonder if YouTube is going to let me play this. And there's someone who knows why this is happening. But there is once again a QR code on the screen that you can use to access the page on the University of Illinois website detailing this composition. Then, of course, we have to speak about Xenakis here. He fundamentally redefined what algorithmic composition could be and embedded complex mathematical models to create controlled randomness. And this is at the heart of his music. He formalized 2 strands of stochastic music, kind of the pre-stochastic processes. And these 2 processes are written about in his book, Formalized Music. Beyond computational breakthroughs, he was also an architect. This is exemplified in many of his works. And in his innovations, then we see this the stochastic composition techniques coming in, and the role of architecture and mathematic processes. So, to me, my introduction to all of this was with pure data. And pure data was created by Pickett and released an open source re-implementation of the earlier Max work. And this invited anyone to build real-time audio patches without barriers created by proprietary software. It's kind of a visual box and patch board, so kind of think of it very similarly to any kind of circuit. And it lets artists literally see the flow of the music that they're creating and rewriting. So in 2003, Cycling 74 extended this in Max MSP with Jitter. And this then creates a set of objects for manipulating video, for 3D geometry, matrix data, and all of this can happen in real time. So to musicians and multimedia artists, these environments are extremely appealing because they collapse the distance between the idea that you have and the implementation of your idea. You can literally drag and drop new objects into your patch, tweak parameters, and immediately hear what results from that tweaking. So the visual grammar really encourages the artist to explore in a playful manner and creates a living score that's interactive and that's very visual, and that could even serve as the basis for installations. So while the underlying data flow model scales from simple audio effects to complex audiovisual installations, making Pure Data and Max MSP very enduring. So I foresee these kinds of visual languages continuing to be very important, at least to me, for quite a while. And then I cannot speak about the examples that I'm going to share with you today without speaking about Eno's work as well. So generative music describes work that evolves through autonomous systems rather than fixed scores. And it's set in motion, but then continues to evolve itself. It's kind of one of the pioneers in this field is Brian Eno. And in the 70s, he really started working on this field. There's rule-based grammars, cellular automata, fractals, and even simple randomness that seeds patterns, which then unfold differently for each performance. More recently, artists have layered this with neural net models such as Magenta and live sensor input. This is something that can be done in Max to create music that continually responds to an environment, an audience, networks of data. So I find this very interesting because as someone trained in classical music, the exploring the boundary between where creation ends and where human creativity ends is very interesting. On the screen, you'll see an app called Bloom, and it combines various generative patterns, and the user then taps to create and share soundscapes. So once again, you can use the QR code to go to the app and to explore it. It's very soothing. So this is my first little experiment in data sonification. I was working with a climate scientist, just informally discussing possible collaborations at the university, at the Faculty of Environmental Sciences. And he introduced me to the climate science portal by the World Bank. So this is data from there. Showing variance in temperature. So from the mean temperature at any given year within a specific month, what was the variance? And I explored many ways at this point to think about sonifying the data. And so what you just heard is really it's sound. It's not music. It's just these variance from the mean temperature then quantized to MIDI notes and mapped onto a MIDI keyboard. And so at this point, then it's pure data sonification. And I then started thinking about, it's very difficult to decide how close to this data sonification you want to stay. And so in the next example, this is extremely close to the sonification. So this is basically just using this very rigid MIDI output as a sample in a little patch in VCV rack. Oh. Let me just try that again. I muted this. And so in this example, it's just is the traditional fade-out cadence. So in this example, everything is controlled in some way by that signal being sent from the MIDI. And this was kind of the first time that I tried using a data set like that. I am kind of agnostic as to whether this is successful or not. To be at this point in time, it was very important to keep the data set intact and to really think about sonifying that data set. I'm going to share two other examples now where maybe these are slightly less important parameters. So currently then I'm working on this bigger project about hearing local data. And this project is inspired by Anat Singh's work and Mary Douglas's work on feral landscapes and the patchy Anthropocene. So Singh, adhering to this idea of this magnificent Anthropocene is also problematic because our interactions with our world has resulted into this patchwork of domesticated spaces, wilderness spaces, but then also feral spaces, which are the result of this patchwork. And so in this current project, I'm looking very closely at local data and thinking carefully about how this idea of the feral landscape plays into it. So the first little example, so these are all little miniatures from a larger installation that will be at our Masora concert later in the year. But in the first example, I looked at election results. So this is from election, the IEC's election portal. And this is specifically for the Northwest province. And I wondered whether a listener would be able to hear changes in voter sentiment by listening to melodies based on this data. So in the next example, I'm going to show you then in Midinus little examples of this. So this patch is built in Midinus, and it's a multi-circuit sonification of those provincial election results from 2004 to 2024. Each circuit corresponds to an election year, so these circuits over here correspond to election years, and have the results of the 5 leading parties in the Northwest at 2024's election results. And it uses the vote count as a weight for probability-driven melody generation. The pitches are then mapped according to consonance and dissonance relative to C, creating a sonic metaphor for at least how I have read the manifestos of each party and how they align with the current political climate and the stability provided by the ANC over the last 30 years. There's also a pentatonic drone, and this is there to establish a kind of a home base. So once again, in thinking about creating these little sound installations, I'm thinking about what it is like for members of the public to interact with these. And so a big criticism that we face in Western art music specifically is kind of the ugliness and the jarringness of electronic composition in the 20th and 21st century. And this is, of course, a broad generalization and doesn't apply to, I would argue, most musicians working in this space. But I'm thinking very very much about someone accessing these sonifications who has as their background primarily experiences with popular contemporary and commercial music. And then there's also, so we have the weighted probability input here in the melody, but there's also some textural elements. And this I added mostly for aesthetic reasons, because the weighted probability, due to the continued dominance of the ANC in the province, the weighted probability does become monotonous after a while. And I think I thought a lot about this monotony, specifically with our province. I have some work on other provinces as well with the monotony in our province. And the kind of the social meaning of that aesthetic experience of monotony, I think is pretty important. Then there's also a textural layer, which is a second circuit, the one that looks a little bit like the whale at the bottom. And that then triggers those sustained notes, kind of adding an extra harmonic layer. And then, of course, as I said, the bell melody and the Nautilus, which is the name of the patch there, creates a higher register. It punctuates the circuits, the generated melody at various points, and the pitches are chosen at random with a small probability offset, sometimes aligning, sometimes a little bit jarring. And it's to some extent inspired by Cage's procedures of creating fragmented cycles, but to some extent not. It's a little bit more simple than that. And again, it's thinking about what the function of the sonification would be. So the function is for someone to click through these results and to hear how they change over time. So I'm just going to demonstrate how this probability affects these melodic circuits. And so I think what I'm trying to do is to create an accessible way of hearing how change happens in the system. The next example, let me first let you listen. So hyacinth is part of a triptych on aquatic plants found in the Vaal River. Hyacinth speaks in a gentle pentatonic voice with a kind of shimmer produced by the effect. 4 seconds. 4 seconds. It's a pulse that ticks, kind of like a heartbeat, creating a stochastic change in the metro object. So it's like creating a rhythmic field that's organic and not quite mechanical. When it goes through, it triggers a note drawn from the 12-tone scale, but with the selected scale, which in this case is pentatonic, set to a high probability. So that rings out most often. Sometimes, though, if hyacinth runs for quite a while, some dissonant pitches do appear, but these are very infrequent. So the idea with this melody is to create a melody that does feel kind of familiar, although slightly unpredictable. Then there's beneath this melody, the texture created through kind of a sustained ebb and flow. So there's also then the visuals that show the coverage of both water hyacinth and water lettuce, and this is based on the data provided by Rand Water. So on the screen you see evolving in tandem with the noise, so with the phaser that's brought to audio rate. Starting from just 1% coverage, a simulated hyacinth mat that doubles in size every 9 to 11 days in virtual time, of course, and with each pixel's chance of growing into a mat decided by a kind of a coin flip weighted by the current coverage. So you can see this blanket transforming and emerging on the screen, and this is then sonified in that phaser that creates the noise that you heard. And so Hyacinth is this interactive max patch that is meant to let someone explore and draw many of their own conclusions about what this might represent. However, in the end, I hope that this brings the challenge that we face with invasive aquatic plants into focus somewhat, at least. And then I just want to tell you a little bit more about the bigger project and kind of how I see these bigger works fitting together. So the three examples that I showed you today kind of explore the relationships between sound art, maybe soundscapes, and data sonification. And they emerge from some kind of interaction with a rule-based system. So while they foreground data mapping or data sonification, there's also an element that's very generative in all of these. And what is important to me in the larger installation then, which will be the interactive installation at the Masara concert in August, is that there is still a strong musical narrative that emerges. And I am almost agnostic about the aesthetics of this, and I'm not sure what that says about me as a musician. So they are visualizations and they are interactive. They tell a story about something that is happening around us locally. So some of the other ones that I'm currently working with, one is called Meeting Death on the Long Run. And there I am using GIS to document when I encounter death in these feral spaces that I'm running in, and whose death that is and what that says about animal suffering in feral spaces. So the idea is that these interactive sound installations create a way to translate quantitative information and perhaps my own personal experience into a sonified objects that can be interacted with, and that could be the basis of discussion, that could be the basis of further qualitative research, possibly. And so I see this work as sitting at the intersection of music and sound and social sciences. So in the context of the digital humanities, I think projects like this, like Hyacinth and Polscape and Generating Climate Awareness, can open up rich spaces for possibility. They can be methodologically create new possibilities, but they can also go beyond that. And so there are avenues that I still hope to explore within DH practice through these sonifications, specifically exploring multimodal scholarly outputs and how this then can disrupt the publish or perish framework within where we are working, creating interactive notebooks so that readers can read about these soundscapes and hear them as they follow along and interact with them. And I'm hoping that as the NWU's DH Center continues to grow, that there will be space for creating sonic archives that will include creative works like this, but that there will also be spaces where we can archive community-created installations. For me, pedagogically, these also have very important implications because these methods are shared in my community music honors classes. I invite students there, many of whom would never have interacted with any of the interfaces, to create interactive objects, which we then use as an interactive installation. And I'm hoping to build on this to create more partner created installations. So the future of the project is to present workshops and training events and to create OERs that can be used to train community partners in using some of these and to invite then co-created participatory sound installations. I think it's very important to think about the public role of the humanities. And so once again, as I say, it's a line to tread between the effective sonification, aesthetic expectations, and public accessibility. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm going to stop sharing and then I want to see everybody's faces so that we can start a discussion. Many, do you want to facilitate the discussion or do you want me to just do that?
Thank you. No, I can do that, I think. But thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's always really cool to have presentations that have audio. So it's not just that you're just looking at slides and listening to people, but actually something a little bit more. It's like going to a museum or something like that while you're at a presentation. So, so thank you very much for that. I'm not sure if there are a lot of questions. I see one question from Chris, who says, interesting that codifying music is considered contentious. Any music score is a codification of music, although not precise. Not true?
Yes, I think working in community music, we work with lots of oral practices, and they're codifying it and representing it, at least visually, would be contentious in many cases. And I think, as I've spoken to colleagues, this idea that music can be created using these strict rule-based systems seem to sit to varying degrees slightly uncomfortably. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Thank you, Janelize. No, you've clarified it for me. Thank you. Oh, sorry, my dog's not barking. Yes, if I could touch on another point, if you don't mind. As a soundscape composer myself, data is an interesting source for compositional material. But I can't help but think about the usefulness of data sonification, and I'm always asking myself, is it just about creating awareness? Is it about translating data to an audience that cannot comprehend it in its original form? I don't know if you have any more thoughts on it. You have touched on this issue.
I think for me, as I see this work evolving in future, I am hoping that it's going to fulfill participatory, so creating opportunities for public scholarship and interaction and more community engagement around issues. So I am currently discussing collaborations with people in environmental sciences, and we've been working at this for about a year now. And so I see that as part of evolving transdisciplinary public scholarship. I hope that these then can also translate into educational initiatives, being that I come from music education, that would then help to empower kind of the digital upskilling of many of our music students and people at our community partner sites. And so we are working on establishing projects with producers, local producers. And I just see this as another avenue to explore in those projects.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm not sure if there are any more questions. Wait a minute, I see that Chris has also shared the performance at the Masara concert. That will be 5th of August at 6:30 in the evening at the Vijfhoek Dutch Reformed Church in Potchefstroom. So that'll be interesting to listen to. I do see another comment by Graham. This was really fascinating for those who've never explored data sonification. Could you perhaps share some ideas for those who want to get started? Any case studies to read and recommendation tools to get started?
Yes, so Graham, I don't know you, but I think one way to get started is to just play around with something that's node-based, like Medinus. So you can also download Nodal. Medinus is on Steam actually. And then I would suggest looking at Ben Jordan's YouTube content because he has a couple of walkthroughs of Medinus where he explains the functionality. And that would just be to get started on the platform. There's lots of tutorials online as well for Max MSP. And so to learn the tools, I think is a lot of fun. And there's already lots of resources created around that to create lots of fun projects. For instance, interactive webcams that sonify the input from the webcam in Max MSP. I know there's a couple of tutorials for that on YouTube. And Pure Data, that is still open source. Max MSP is pretty low cost. I think it's about $9 a month. Medinus is 150 Rand. So I'm not sure what that would be in dollars on Steam. So these are and that's something that I didn't actually speak about. So in my hardware collection, I don't have many expensive toys. We do have at Masora a field kit, which is amazing. And that's one of the more expensive pieces of equipment. But in the largest scope of electronic music, that's still not an expensive piece of equipment. My own equipment is mostly little Volcas, so Korg's Volcas, which are, some people say, children's toys. And so I like thinking of ways to enter with a low cost. And I think that comes from my background in community music, thinking about accessibility and providing entry with either free or very low cost tools. Thanks. I see Chris copied and pasted the link to Medinus in the chat.
Great, thanks. That sounds really interesting. It actually kind of links, you mentioned now something, question that I had, but yeah, okay, I'll ask my question and then I'll say a little bit more. So I think this Medinus, I don't know the tool, but that mostly focuses on pitch, I guess, right? MIDI has more than just pitch. So I was wondering, in the beginning, I was writing down, so do you only use pitch for data sonification or something like timbre? But then the question is also, how do you decide what to use for what? What kind of impact does this have? So I have no idea how to tackle something like this. But how do you make these kinds of decisions?
So for instance, a lot of what I land on is a lot of experimentation. And as I said, it's a balancing act between making aesthetic decisions and making pragmatic decisions. So in Hyacinth, actually, the panning is affected by the Hyacinth mat as well. And so that also then influences the panning. So there, and then in generating climate data, that was the first example. The entire noise generation, the gates for that also comes from that MIDI. So it's then converted back into a signal to trigger that. And so I think there's lots of ways to do it, and it really depends. In another example that I don't have here today, called Wave Letters, I'm building a wavetable synth, and there the bands are affected in a similar way to higher synth. So it sounds that the resulting sonification is very, very different.
Okay, thank you. I see another comment from Urbi. This is super introduction to a topic that I'm unfamiliar with. Thank you. Do you think that data sonification can widen access to the study of music composition? Comment from a school music teaching perspective. The interactive nature of exploring sound in its playful way seems attractive in the music classroom.
Yes, Urvi, I'm glad that you brought that up. That is how I came to this as well. So at NYU, I've always been interested in electronic music composition, but it seemed like such a daunting and inaccessible field. And it wasn't something that was part of our undergraduate studies. And at that point, it was extremely inaccessible in South Africa, I would say. But luckily, there's been a lot of innovation around this. And so my introduction to kind of the idea that I could create soundscapes really came from MuseEd Labs at NYU, which is a collaboration between the music technology faculty and the music education faculty at NYU. And so they have shared postgrad students, and they design all of these different interfaces. So one of their very well-known ones is called the Groove Pizza, which is an interactive platform where students can learn about meter and rhythm. And they've worked with the Herbie Hancock's Foundation as well. And they have some hip hop, so some sampling things that are created as OERs for schools. And so my introduction to this is actually as an educator. I also used to apply these kind of gamified composition things in my high school classroom with a lot of success. So I would say something like MIDI-NUS could potentially, with a music educator who understands how to move, if your goal is to train students in traditional Western art music, you would need an educator who understands how to move from this nodal space, which is, I would say, to some extent, a lot more intuitive than Western staff notation would be, but who understands how to move from that to Western staff notation. Something that is nice about Max, is that there is an object that shows you the pitch of what is being generated. So within an educational context, that would be very helpful because the student would be able to view the pitches of what is being generated constantly. And so there's a direct translation from that Max generation into Western staff notation.
Well, thank you. I realize we're running a little bit out of time, 4 minutes past 11. I'm not sure if there are any more questions. I mean, I'm happy to stay a little bit longer, but I also realize that people might need to leave for next meetings. Just checking if there are any more questions. So I personally really liked your presentation, and now you mentioned something about the visualization aspect that you haven't really talked much about because of course you were talking about the music. But are there systems that also incorporate visualizing? So you showed that I forgot the name that I think was your last example where you see some visualization of the data as well. Is that something that you're working on?
Yes, so that's actually, I think, why Max is so currently so popular, because you can do both visualization. You can also do 3D geometry in Max, and you can create soundscapes. So I would, if you want to make kind of multimedia visualizations, I would explore Max.
Cool, thank you. I don't see any more questions. But then I would really like to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Like I told you earlier, I love it if you have presentations with audio. It's not just that you're looking at slides. But I think this was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.